In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Glory to Jesus Christ. Today we hear the story of the wicked servant, the greatly forgiven servant, the servant that was forgiven an impossible amount and then turned around and refused to forgive someone who owed him a much lesser amount. But there are several key things about this particular parable that are vital for us to understand, because otherwise we will be tempted to treat it as a merely sentimental sort of story that just has the nice message that we should forgive. Because Christ says this is a parable about the nature of the kingdom of heaven. So this isn't just a moral story about what we should do, but it's a story about the very nature of the kingdom of heaven, the logic of God, in other words. This is how God's logic functions. So if we want to understand how God thinks, we often look to the parables to be able to see just in that way the kingdom of heaven, which is to say the logic of God, functions. Because in the beginning of this parable, we find out that this gentleman owes the king, this servant, owes the king 10,000 talents. Okay, Father, what are 10,000 talents? That's a good question. Because when we look up 10,000 talents, we find out that 10,000 talents amount to about, not if you do it in terms of money, but if you calculate it or factor it according to how much time it would have taken for the servant to earn this amount of money. It would have taken the servant about 150,000 years of work to pay off this debt. Anywhere from 150,000 days of work to 200,000 days of work. That is the amount of debt that this man owed the king. Now remember, we're talking about the nature of the kingdom of heaven here, so we can ask ourselves different sorts of questions of this parable. One is, how could this servant have worked up such a debt? How could he have worked up a debt that would have not taken 1 year, not 10 years, not even a lifetime of debt, but 150,000 to 200,000 years of debt? How could he have accumulated that? It's amazing to think of that. But in this story, we are asked to place ourselves in this position of this servant, because before we even meet, just as we meet him, he's already in this debt, which is telling us that when we meet God, we meet him with a similar debt. Now, the debt, obviously, with God is not money. The debt is sin. Often when we think of sin, we think, oh, I made a mistake, I wasn't nice to someone, I lost my temper for a couple hours. We think of them in these terms of action, but we often don't think of sin in terms of debt. In terms of it actually places us in a distance from God that would require this gap between us and God to be bridged, this gap between us and God to be closed. And so the debt is literally impossible for us to pay off. That's the whole idea of this debt being 10,000 talents, or 200,000 years worth of debt. Because it's impossible for us to pay off our sin. Why? Often we don't feel the weight of sin. And it's precisely our inability to feel the weight of sin that causes us to treat God's forgiveness cheaply. We treat God's grace cheaply because we don't have a way of measuring or evaluating its value. We don't know the value of anything unless we have something to compare it to. If someone said that you sold a car for 1,000,000 rupees, which is an Indian form of money, I don't know how much a rupee is worth. 10,000 rupees could be $100, as far as I know, or it could be $10 million. The idea, though, is if we don't know what something is worth, if we have no basis of comparison, we can't sense how it matters. And so Christ is trying to show us today how much sin matters so that we can understand how much forgiveness matters. Because if we don't understand the severity or the depth of sin, we won't really care. It won't matter to us about God's forgiveness. And then when we find out at the end of the reading today that God was then angry again with this sinner, we'll say, why should God be angry? We'll get offended at God's anger because we don't understand the depth and depravity of sin. Sin is an extremely severe thing. So much so that in the logic of God, it's unpayable by man. Now, if someone loses their temper on day 1 for an hour or two, then they lose their temper on day 2, they go day 3 without losing their temper, day 4 they enter into some sort of lying or exaggeration to try to make themselves feel better. On day 5, they're very good that day. On day 6, they overeat. They are gluttons. They take food that doesn't belong to them, essentially. We will typically see those as just all these different actions. But the nature of sin is to look under these actions at the pattern of them. What's producing the losing of the temper? What's producing the judging of our neighbor? What's producing the ambition? What's producing the backbiting? What's producing the gossip? When we confess our sin, I did the sin of gossip, I did the sin of complaining, I did the sin of judging. We say all of those things, but what's underneath all of them is this pattern that comes from nowhere but the heart. So it's not just that we made a mistake in our action and we slipped and we stumbled. The problem is that our heart is wrong. Christ wasn't gluttonous. He wasn't ambitious. He didn't have a cross word. He didn't lose his temper in any unjust way ever. He never lied, never did anything. His heart was perfect and clean, meek and lowly. But us, we wonder, why do we keep mistaking all the time? Why am I always fighting with my spouse? Why can't I get along with my parents? Why can't I get along with my children? Why doesn't anyone listen to me? And then we complain. And we judge. Where does all of that come from? Why are we angry and afraid so often? Because there's something wrong with our heart. And it's called sin. And that unrighteousness that's in our heart literally is a rebellion against God. God says, love your neighbor. We say, no, I'd rather judge my neighbor. It's not just about judging the mistake I made. The sin is a direct affront to God. Remember in the parable, the servant owed the king the debt. The debt of sin that we have the harm or wound of sin is actually a rebellion against God. So when we look at ourselves, we typically don't think of ourselves as stiff-necked rebels. We typically think of ourselves as, I'm okay. I'm not as good as I could be. I'm working on myself. I'm trying to become a better person. The Lord won't worry about it that I do all of these, that there's something with my heart that's wrong. He'll understand. But we don't understand, and we don't take into account that it's against God that we're sinning. We often say, well, this is maybe wrong, that's maybe wrong, maybe this is okay. Some people think that, doing these things is okay. I'm not going to, say anything about what's right. We don't ask, what does God say about it? What does God say about what's right and what's wrong? It's God who establishes the parameters of righteousness. So when we are unrighteous, when we act out of faithlessness, fear, anger, judgment, complaining, bitterness, anger, when we act out of those things, it's not just that our personality is, maybe we're a little rough around the edges. It's not just that we're rough around the edges, it's actually we're in opposition to a holy God, being ourselves unholy. And when we think about it this way, we say, oh, it's hopeless. It's hopeless. Which is exactly what the parable is trying to share with us. The man realized that he owed 200,000 years of labor to the king. Impossible to pay that off. And what does he do? He falls before the feet of the king and begs him and says, have mercy on me. Have mercy on me. This is the logic of heaven, right? And the king, moved with pity and compassion, forgives this man the entire debt. All those of us who have gone before God and said, I am a wicked sinner, Lord, forgive me, God is moved with compassion upon that moment to forgive all of it. God says, you thought you owed the debt? I will absorb that debt. He doesn't just throw it out willy-nilly, because we understand that on the cross, Christ paid the penalty for sin. So God says, you owe all of this. You have this sin debt, this unrighteousness in you. I will absorb your debt. I will take it upon myself and you can go free. I had all of this, the weight of this debt, 200,000 years of labor getting ready to flood on you. But you came to me and you asked for mercy. And I put away all of your debt for you. And I brought you to my bosom and I absorbed all of it and I forgive you. Which is the one and only method that we can understand the magnitude and the magnificence of God's forgiveness. Otherwise, God's forgiveness will seem cheap. But God does not sell his forgiveness cheap. He absorbs all of the pain of it into himself so that he can transform it all to a blessing, to set each of us free from the weight of sin. So unless we understand the weight of sin, we won't understand the glory of forgiveness. And somehow this man, who even though he was forgiven, all of that. And this is the temptation of the church. For us to be in the church, having received this abundant forgiveness, and then turn and look to our neighbor and say, you know what? I'm going to call you to account right now. You sinned against me. I'm angry at you. You did what I didn't like. I'm angry at you. And if I don't tell you to your face, I'll tell you and I'll whisper it to this person and to that person. And I'll spread gossip about you. You know what my boss did? What an awful boss. Do you know what my mom did? Can you believe it? I was on the road. Can you believe that police officer pulled me over for no reason? And I think he really stinks. And we just rail against everyone and everything, always with the hardness of heart, where we don't recognize how much we've been forgiven. And so God is pleading with us to forgive each other by recognizing how much we've been forgiven. How could we not forgive a small debt when we've been forgiven an impossible debt? How can we not forgive a person who sins so many times against us? And God absorbed the entire debt of all of our sin freely and asked nothing of you but that you live for Him and follow Him. Pure goodness, pure love. He says His yoke is easy and His burden is light, and that He is meek and lowly of heart. So He calls us to be like Him, to be loving, merciful, kind, forgiving, and gentle, even to a fault, to absorb and not point out the sins of our neighbors, but to cover them, make excuses for them, pull them aside and have a heart-to-heart conversation. I noticed such and such happened. Are you okay? Go along beside someone instead of standing across and judging them or throwing words out that allow no conversation. We have been forgiven much, more than we could ever repay. So let us all sense the gloriousness of God's forgiveness. Let us walk each moment without forgetting the magnificence of His mercy. Glory to Jesus Christ.